Welcome to the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, the place where research meets the real world. I'm Dr. Dion Stevens, your host and co-author of the book Psychology of Black Womanhood and professor of psychology at Florida International University. Disciplining children is an essential part of parenting, and the methods used vary across cultures and families. Black mothers specifically often face pressures to carefully examine their approaches due to stereotypes that portray them as overly strict or controlling. Even though the research has found that Black mothers' discipline approaches often center discussion and intertwine values and historical experiences, racialized assumptions affect how their discipline methods are perceived by others, particularly in school or public settings. This episode features Dr. Carla Atkins Johnson, professor in the Department of Counselor Education and Counseling Psychology at Western Michigan University. Her book, African American Child Discipline: Culturally Responsive Practices, critically examines the child disciplinary practices of African American mothers and fathers with school-age children in the home. Dr. Atkinson Johnson's current research is focused on African American young adults' perceptions of child discipline and the criminalization of African American disciplinary practices. I reached out to you because of your book, Child Discipline in African American Families: Culturally Responsive Policies. And it's a really unique book in that there's not a lot of offerings like that. So I'm wondering, what motivated you to write that book?
Thank you. And thank you for wanting to have this conversation, Dr. Stevens. I mean, I think it's kind of long overdue. And this has kind of been a research agenda and journey of mine for quite some time. I would say probably over 29 years. It originally started as a dissertation project then, and then after a series of different research studies, I keep asking the question, is that what does child discipline really look like in African American families? And so, as I said in my book, I started out a long time ago as a child protective services worker. And that's where you kind of go and you do investigations for alleged child abuse or physical abuse in particular. And there were just a couple cases that I just wasn't comfortable with, and that a parent was automatically given sanctions if they were to physically discipline their child. And that was that, one, they could risk losing custody of their child. It was assumed that the parent was reckless. It was assumed that the parents did not really know what was in the best interest of their child. And even when the situation, I felt, even as a worker, was, okay, it was a little over the top. Like, say a young woman had a young man over, they were 13, 14, parents weren't in the house at the time. They were told you can't have somebody at the house, and things went into another level. So, the parents get upset. And so because it wasn't designated really as a physical abuse case per se, it was the way they looked at the family and the various sanctions that case workers had, that particularly child welfare workers, that caused me to pause. Fast forward, I go into my profession is counseling. So I'm a licensed professional clinical counselor, and I train counselors, also train psychologists as well. Through various, I always did different studies around this fact of, or this idea of, trying to get at the truth, because the social science literature talks about spanking. And I would say across all racial lines, we know more about whether a parent does or does not. What we know the least about, even across racial lines, is, okay, well, why, how, and what, right? And is this the dominant thing that impacts children, or is this something that a parent does as their definitive tool of disciplining children? When it comes to Black parents in particular, all that I could run across was that the notion or the perception that we always beat our kids. We beat our kids because we learned that from slavery. And we didn't know anything until we came here, or we were brainwashed by, white slave owners, because our lives were in danger during that time on countless occasions, in over 400 years, pretty much, as we were in chattel slavery. But my thought at the time, before actually laying the data lead, was that, okay, even in the most horrific circumstances, we still expressed our agency. and we still express our agency as adults, as parents and children. So something about that didn't sit well, that it was an automatic way in which we raise children. So I wanted to find that out. So I've done about 3 or 4 different studies over a period of 20 years, and each one either collecting samples of 100 parents, sometimes it's 175, and then also doing counseling, with families and parents on this notion of child discipline. And so the book really highlights the data. It highlights what do African American mothers and fathers do, and what do they do together as a united front. Doesn't necessarily mean that they have to be married, but what do they do as a united front or not? And then also, how does the conversations, how does that connect with the overall conversations in social services, particularly child welfare and the law, dependency court, which is connected to child welfare? And how are they viewing, continue to view Black families in this negative light?
I think it's really important that you highlighted the data that you collected and the amount of data. So it's not just opinion or what we think. But I also find it interesting, and I remember in grad school too, most of the research on Black families around parenting was always about abuse. And it's always done in comparison. And we see these memes about Black mamas be like, if you don't listen, you're going to feel, versus white mothers who will talk. Why do you think this assumption persists? Why do we keep framing it in this way?
Well, we have these racial assumptions, right? We have racial assumptions that we are not intellectual. We're not human beings. So therefore, like animals we don't think really have a mind. Well, I think they sometimes make maybe dogs or cats more intellectual than I think sometimes that they may see African American families or children. But I think because they think we're still of that mindset of how they saw us during slavery, that everything we do must be second guessed or supervised or under surveillance of. You have law professor Dr. Dorothy Roberts, who often has talked about the notion of parents being under surveillance, and so rightfully so. I cite her quite often, and many others who have challenged this notion of how we are seen as being reckless, as being violent, as being incapable of raising children at all times, I think leads to assumption that parenting while Black means that a child is at risk of being harmed if they are in a Black family. And so I think that, and my colleague and I, Attorney Dorothy Payne, who is a public defender, who also has a chapter in the book, we talked about that in some of our earlier work in the Family Court Review article in 2016. We brought up this notion about parenting while Black. It's a term that people use now, and I don't know who coined or who started it first. I don't think it really matters. I think it does resonate with everybody, right? In that, it's just that because you are Black and you try to raise your children, there's some question about it if it doesn't match to whatever a white mainstream perspective of perfect parenting is. And I say that because the research was so that even white families may not live up to that paradigm of whatever perfect parenting is defined at that time. I think the term now is positive parenting. So now it's been labeled as positive discipline versus negative discipline. And they'll have certain strategies and things within those categories. So my book was, in the whole point of this racial assumption is that, can we assume in the normal part as opposed to the pathological part? We assume pathology as opposed to assume normality. We should assume wellness. We should assume that a parent is making a concerted effort to raise their child the best way they know how. And that best way they know how is a very strategic, intentional point where they can use their agency. Do we have child abuse happening in Black families? Of course we do. We have that in like any other family would, because I want to just put that out there. And one of the things about the book that I want to emphasize what I saw and what my data showed about child discipline. I wasn't exploring child abuse. Just because the term spanking is used, and even across all racial lines, does not automatically mean it is a term of abuse. But sometimes it appears that who sometimes is using it is where it's moved more into the category of that than it being abusive in and of itself. I think right now in the social science literature, there's deeming the outcome research is inconclusive. Does it automatically mean that if you're spanked that you're going to have lifelong damages? Correlational data may show, but causal data does not necessarily make that a fact. So it's not cause and effect. You were spanked, so therefore it's automatically going to be, a negative thing. But I would say what my research is kind of showing is that if this is what a parent leads with, and that's all the parent does, yes, that is something to consider and watch. Because from the way that child discipline, I think, is described by, social science and counseling and the like, is that if all they want to do and all they can express themselves with their child to guide them is spanking a child, then that in of itself, of course, is problematic. So I just wanted to kind of discern between the two.
Right. No, I appreciate that. This idea that there's one form of spanking, but like you said, there's a range and degree of what's happening.
Right.
It might not be surprising to you, but what are some of the findings that might have been surprising to people, since we often come in leading with these assumptions about Black parents and how they discipline?
Well, I kind of went in thinking, but I have to say too, and I haven't got a chance to talk this about my own personal thoughts, so thank you for allowing me to give this additional insight outside of the book, is that I went in, when I first started this 29 years ago, my first study, I went in saying no matter what I found, if I found that Black families were whooping their kids 24/7, I was going to make sure the data was interpreted appropriately. And if there were things we needed to do to make sure children are not harmed on this ongoing basis, I was prepared to do that. So I really wanted to make sure I went in with a lens of, I need to find out. And if there is something that should be cause for concern, and that would be a cause for concern, if that's what I was going to find, I was prepared. What did cause me to pause, and then later as I continue to do this work, just very eye-opening, is the strategy that Black parents use. It was very eye-opening and impressive sometimes on the lengths that parents take to explain a situation and to make sure a child understands the rules before the rules are applied to them. And so often I found that in interviewing parents and in some of the quantitative studies is that generally there was a first response to a discipline situation. And then if the child repeated the behavior, the parents had a strategic second response. And how we arrived at that is that we would set up a scenario on some of our earlier studies and said, if your child did this, say the child got into an altercation with their sibling while the parent's on the phone, I was trying to match the scenarios to what common types of things that Black parents deal with their children. So the scenarios are very relevant to Black culture. And so if a child did that or two siblings did, I asked the parent, what would you do first if the child did this? Parent would answer the question. Okay, if the child did not stop this behavior and repeated it again, what would you do second? What the study showed is that the parents use what we consider a hierarchical response. And that means is that they often would start in with the least restrictive, and usually the number one parenting method that parents use, mothers and fathers, Black mothers and fathers, is discussion. There was a lot of the discussion. They explained the rules beforehand. But then the first warning or the first step is like they would tell the child, don't do that again. Or, hey, that was not good. Look at the implications of this. The second response, they would kick it up a notch. Sometimes that notch was a warning. If you don't, you're going to withdraw the privileges, often when the child is older and could understand. Generally, a withdrawal of privileges often started around the 10 to 11, but it was the most preferred technique for 12 to 14 and 15 to 17-year-olds. You didn't see it as much from 3 to 5, because I did ask about that, because developmentally the parents are like, well, they really don't really understand that. So you find a lot of discussion and explaining for the little ones if that's the case. So you find the hierarchical strategic way of how they address situations. The other thing we found in that I would say eye-opening, but also very informative was these hierarchical situations were also context driven. So I would give mild context scenarios. I would give moderate context. And then I gave the famous severe ones, right? Because I got the question a lot as I was doing my study through the years, like, okay, parents want to know, I want them to know about that severe. What did you find about that? Because parents want to know sometime what my outcome of the studies were. And those severe is the teenage things that we see now that drives a parent into orbit, right? And that is, you tell a child to do something, they're 15 and they turn around and say, shut up talking to me. Something like that, right? So when I use that scenario, when I'm doing workshops with child welfare or with court officials, even they have a reaction in the room when they said, you mean a kid would actually say that? I said, well, of course, they would. And I know they would as a clinician. But I wanted to know what parents thought when that happened. And generally, it wasn't automatic that 90% of them would move to physical discipline on that second go round. Also, it didn't happen automatically on the first time the child did it. It just depends. And so when I did the qualitative work, it depends on so many different factors. Was the child upset? Did something happen that the parent did not know about? But one thing most parents said is that, oh, I'm the parent and you're not. So they didn't have a lot of give and take when the child moves to the level where they're confrontative with their parent. But yes, at times physical discipline did take place, but it changed, right? And when it was physical and they're older, if it's fathers, it's not the use of a belt. Black fathers in particular are the least ones that were using physical discipline when it was used. And then it changed a lot. It wasn't that there was a belt and spanking. It might be that, might have jacked them up against the wall or something because the kid, it said, shut up talking to me to a father, and they're looking at that. And again, these are the various scenarios. And then I also was able to get some real life situations with my qualitative research, which is what's in the book. So yeah, I think it's just the strategy, the hierarchy, the context is the most important thing, that it just depends on what's going on. And maybe we can talk a little bit later about more of that context situation.
Actually, I want to get into the context now. As you're telling these stories, I think it's great because there's a piece within the family and how it's happening. But we often hear when it's public, so when the child acts out in a way that's risky publicly, that's when the parents might act out, and it's more because of protection. And you hear this with Black and brown children, because we know Black boys are treated like young men and Black girls are adultified. Was that something that came up in your research?
It was, but I know there was an incident, I think it was during the Black Lives Matter movement. It was something where a young man was participating and his mother came and got him and hit him upside the head or something. I can't remember how that went. With the study, what I found is parents didn't necessarily say they disciplined their children as a reaction to what society would see of them. That was not their primary rationale. Their rationale for rearing their children, as they would say, is one, they wanted their child to have an important sense of themselves, an important sense of the family that they were in. The name of the family meant something. They were connected to an overall community, but they wanted their children to have a purpose in their life, and the spiritual aspect of them being these spiritual beings, right? Self-determination, all of the things that Dr. Wade Nobles talks about when you see often the African-centered principles in approach. I would say very much I saw of what parents would say first about why they reared their children the way they did. Racial socialization was very spot on and very important in terms of the child knowing who they are. Of course, they talked about concerns about the behavior of their children and how, say, the school system would react to that behavior, or, how the legal system, or if they're stopped by the police, to, not be so defiant that it puts them at risk. But the basis of why they select certain discipline strategies was not a reaction to how society sees Black children. However, they are cognizant of that as they move along the process. I would say a lot of the work of Dr. Howard Stevenson and his perspective on racial socialization really, I think, sets the tone often of what these parents did. And so so it's always an interesting question when I get that, because on the one hand, we have to acknowledge the reality, and parents do. But I think the data does not support. That's why they pick the strategies that they do. So if something is like that, parents are picking spanking because it was how they saw children during slavery, the data does not support that, nor it really makes us as a people very blank slate and narrow-minded, like we did not have a view of ourselves or the importance of life, agency, and all of those things before the slave ships came to the U.S. Did slavery, of course, cause a lot of trauma for us as Black families? Of course it did. You're talking about children ripped from their families to never see them again. Those types of things can go down through generations, but that doesn't mean it takes us out, and trauma doesn't define us as African Americans, because during those times, our spiritual sense of self kicks in. And it's not automatic that was the only way we defined our existence. We still had families, we still raised children in the midst of those horrific conditions. And so I think looking at child discipline, we just don't want to make a lot of assumptions that defined how, and the only way to define how we instituted and sometimes reconfigured Black families when we needed to.
Your book actually has culturally responsive policies. And so
Yeah.
I really like the fact that you address the importance of policy and research informing policy. So could you maybe tell us what you see as the legal and societal implications for African American parents who might be scrutinized by social systems for their disciplinary practices in whatever form they take?
Thank you. Yes, that one of the chapters in the book talks about that particularly. It gives a scenario of what a clinician would do in working with a Black couple in particular, that one of the parents was brought up on charges of physical abuse, of how they were reacting to a discipline situation with their child. And then they had to do mandatory counseling, anger management, often where they send Black parents to address that. It's complicated, but heavily, heavily full of racial assumptions about who we are in our perspective of how they see us, how they see Black mothers. I'll start that first. The idea of Black mothers being violent, reckless, in particular, reckless and feeble-minded, and, very much how they saw us years ago. So for child welfare, often sometimes to assume the mother has to prove herself innocent, as opposed to assuming that the mother was looking into the best interest of her child first. We see that often what research shows in some of the qualitative studies, that for white mothers, they may be given that benefit. Black mothers are not. So Black mothers have to be in a position sometime to always explain what's going on in their families. My advocacy for Black mothers and Black families, but I'm going to deal with Black mothers first, is I always get to the point about saying, demand and make sure you're able to document what your child discipline program is. And you use those words. This is my program of discipline. This isn't a one and done. This is where I start probably before my child was in the womb, before they're born. This has been how we create the rules to make sure my child remembers the rules. This is when my child developmentally does something. I make sure that I understand developmentally, but so does my child. How older siblings should react to each other, and the strategy, the agency, meaning that in the face of, say there's an alcoholic parent in the house, in the face of foreclosure, in the face of not having a house, say they're unhoused, I can still look out for the best interest of my child. I still have the ability to know what's good for them. And I think setting that up by talking about what you do and how you do it is important. Unfortunately, not only do you have to make sure child welfare understands, but you also have to make sure legal counsel does. Because often who represents you may have those same assumptions about you as a Black mother. It's no, coincidence that often Black mothers are referred to anger management because they think all Black women are angry, right? And so even myself, as a college professor, that's the first go-to when I'm very intentional about trying to explain something. We use our hands. I'm using them now. My neck rolling, everything else, because we bring it to
I'm
the
right
table.
there with you, right?
That's right. And so I would expect nothing less. And every once in a while, you may have to set it off, as mothers tell me, into trying to explain. But the idea is to be able to present the full range of that. Black fathers, it's a whole different category for them because already the system dismisses them, right? If you are not present in their definition of present. And so when you're dealing with child welfare, present for that means, you're in the house 24/7, you're doing this, you're doing that, you don't have a record, but still they may ask the mother about the father. Something about having a conversation with a Black father, you don't necessarily see a lot in the literature. So I purposely had a chapter on hearing from Black fathers and how they discipline their children, what was discipline priorities to them. Very much for Black fathers, just like, look, it's discussion, it's discussion, it's discussion. Even when the category was severe, they'll lean in with discussion. Now, they may be more firm about that discussion, but they have it. But they have bottom lines too when they're dealing with their teenagers, particularly when they're dealing with their teenage sons, but they also raise their daughters as well. But when they're going into the system, they really do have to be intentional about the discipline program to not be disrespected or dismissed, that they are a viable voice in the system, and to redefine that I can be on a united front with the mother without us living in the same house. Same thing for mothers. So I do a lot of outside work when I do counseling with families who are doing this counseling from a proactive aspect. I run counseling groups for Black parents who are just interested of how to do things better. And the united front is often which I always drive home. It's like, look, at the end of the day, you don't even have to like each other as parents. I'm not interested in that. I'm just interested in, do you both have a vested interest in your child and children? I know you both do. So the idea is, how can you be on the same page that whatever goes on at your house goes on at the other house, no matter who else is in the home, and to respect each other enough to facilitate that aspect of that. But the legal system for Black men assumes criminal first, and then father is not even a second. So you really have to fight more and talk about your discipline program, re-educate the attorney that is your right, in terms of being a father and the like. So I would say that the United Front, how they are individually, but having to challenge child welfare and the legal system about having their say-so and voice. The other thing I would say in the legal system is bringing in experts who have a knowledge about Black families, bringing in psychologists that actually do research on racial socialization, that actually do research on the context of child discipline and child rearing in Black families. So that means you could have someone that can give you the good, the bad, and the ugly, but they actually weigh in on context. The other thing is when you're looking at expert witnesses too, and an expert witness, for those that may not know, is that the court will often ask for the attorney to bring a representative that can inform the court and also the jury, if necessary, on the importance of various topics or data or behaviors. So sometimes you may have a witness who, it could be a social worker who has worked with the family. They could come in as a witness of fact, right? They can come in where they're saying, okay, I've seen this person in counseling and these are my assumptions. So the book talks about that, because we have to interrogate also that child welfare worker or that social worker. Okay, what's your training? in actually working with Black families. Having a multicultural counseling course or having a diversity course does not make you an expert on Black families or Latinx families or what have you. You want to know exactly how many clients have they seen? If so, what were the outcomes? What does the research say? In terms of that, to test to see of their knowledge base, because often they're looking for compliance of a Black parent as opposed to the parenting strategies of the Black parent. The Black parent is then viewed for how compliant they are to whatever CPS says they have to do. Now, sometimes they get pushback in some workshops that I do from legal experts to say, well, at the end of the day, is it that you want the child to go home with the family and for the family to be united together, and it's just a matter to make things easier for the court? I said, well, that's exactly what happens. The court then begins to raise Black children, and the court begins to redefine Black families. And that's not the nature or the constitutional right that Black families have. If all families have the right to raise children as they see fit, that the Constitution says, why isn't it applied to Black families? And so the whole point is that I know of social workers, and some are not all Black, that actually do look at context, do the extra work and the research to try to get at this kind of information. And also attorneys should be spending time to try to get the information as well too. In the book, we have a chapter for attorneys that actually help them to develop a child discipline protocol for them to be able to get for their clients before they go into court, so they have ample information to be able to talk about when they're in litigation. That was also written by attorney Dorothy Payne.
How can we encourage wider conversations about parenting, particularly among Black women, and shifting our narratives about healthy disciplinary practice, that this is the norm, instead of still playing on these stereotypes?
I think what you just said is it. I think, how do we define what is healthy discipline? Let's first start about what we found. Let's first talk about, and maybe, what has Black researchers found through the years? This isn't new in terms of Black research on Black families. I stand on the shoulders and draw on all of the qualitative studies that were done from the 1940s. Even Dr. Fraser, the sociologist, that's even a little controversial, but he did go in to study Black families, during the Great Migration. The Philadelphia study, also 1909 by W.E.B. Du Bois, looked at various things that we did. But then you start getting into the work of Dr. Marie Peters, who in 1976, she's a graduate of Harvard in human development, that went into 9 families and pretty much lived with them, if you will, Black families in the South, and wanted to know in detail their child rearing ways, and saw herself what was going on. We had also a Dr. Barnes who went in the 80s. We had several other people that have taken the time to have these exhaustive conversations about how does a parent discipline, what's important to, what do they value. And once we start hearing those conversations on top of how parents weigh in, focus groups and things that we can have of conversation, then I think we have more at the table to discuss. If spanking is the center of the discussion, we'll miss everything. Just like if discussion is at the center of discussion, we'll miss everything. So I think once we start looking at big picture to narrow down, what does Black discipline look like? That's the question. I don't want to be the only one to try to answer that. I'm not the only one and there's many people that have different perspectives that's out there that I think are all valid. Now what happens when we're all talking about it, and then what does it look like when we pull all of it together? And I think that's what is probably more needed. And so parents don't feel guilty about, because that's the other thing too. I think silence in the Black community is powerful, unfortunately. So if a parent feels that they're not raising their child just right, they won't say anything. I don't want the person who perceives they're doing everything right to be the loudest voice in the room. The idea is we can learn from each other, and the parent who thinks that they're not doing something right may find out that, okay, maybe the struggle was a part of the process that was needed for your child, and you. Maybe that there might have been a physical abuse situation that happened. But here's the thing. The system is supposed to be, child welfare is supposed to protect children, but offer services to families when there really is a problem. That part of the conversation, I think, for Black families has gotten lost, meaning that the system does go in to remove. Unfortunately, as opposed to going in to see, okay, what services are needed, but we got to have a true assessment of what those services are. That might help open the conversation some, because rightfully so, many parents are afraid that if I talk too much, I will lose custody of my children because they see the numbers like we do.
What's next for you then? Like, where's the next
glad
project
you asked
and
me
what
that.
are you looking at?
So I'm in the middle of another project, have some new data, which I'm excited about. Already I have some preliminary findings. So I moved the focus to children. So instead of asking the parents what they do, I am now asking young adults, what did your parents actually do? Basically the same questions that we asked Black parents over the years. We asked two things. We asked one, if you did this as a behavior, what do you think your parent would have done? And these are people between the ages of 18 to 26. We chose that group because they're young enough to remember all of the stages preschool up to 15 to 17 years of age to kind of say, okay, what do you think they would do? The second thing we then asked, what did they do when you were this age? How often did they spank you? How often did they use withdrawal? What age did they do this? We asked for them to get perspective of their mothers and perspective of their fathers. What we found is very interesting. There wasn't a lot of physical discipline, as I think people may think. The hope is to take it on a national level, to continue to grow the sample, because we've asked the parents. Now let's ask our youth. Youth this age, they will let you know, right? They will let you know the problems of, maybe how we might have raised children. And I'm interested in hearing their perspective so that we can have a comprehensive perspective of what that is. So that's kind of my exciting study that I'm doing right now.
That was Dr. Carla Atkinson Johnson, professor in the Department of Counselor Education and Counseling Psychology at Western Michigan University, and author of the book, African American Child Discipline, Culturally Responsive Policies. Thank you so much for tuning into today's episode of the Psychology of Black Womanhood podcast, where research is meeting the real world. We're hoping you're enjoying these conversations that mix academic insights with real-life stories. We'd love to hear your thoughts about the podcast, so keep the feedback coming. Send us your comments or any topic requests you'd like us to cover. And don't forget to share your favorite episodes with your friends and family so we can keep spreading awareness and creating change together. Finally, be sure to grab a copy of the Psychology of Black Womanhood book, the book that accompanies this podcast from your favorite bookseller. Appreciate you for tuning in and catch you next time. Until then, let's keep the conversation going and keep grounding them in research that reflects our truth.